Hi everybody, welcome to the MELT Level 2 Teacher Training Review. I'm excited to give you this PowerPoint presentation just as your overview of what you've experienced thus far in the MELT method, to review a little bit of the science for you here, as well as talk about the Level 1 moves and what you're going to experience in the Level 2 Teacher Training. So to start this off, we know MELT is a simple self-treatment technique that you can do at home to get out and stay out of chronic pain in just 10 minutes a day. And we use these specially designed soft body rollers and balls to help rehydrate the connective tissue system and rebalance the nervous system. The ultimate goal of MELT is to help the human body's efficiency by addressing the missing link to pain-free living, which is hydrated connective tissue. And we know that the origins of pain we talked about can happen from lots of things: accidents, illness, injury, side effects of trauma, and of course emotional distress can also send you pain signals and send you into quite a disarray of pain. So in the trainings, we've talked about this pain primer of what do we really know about pain? And we know that pain is a subjective experience. It's very hard to objectively measure. We talked about these two types of pain. We've got the acute pain category, which is traditionally termed as something that was a result of a sudden specific source that can be diagnosed and treated by meds or surgery. So you get hit by a bus, or you hit your hand with a hammer, or you burn yourself. Those will be an acute pain signal, and it's usually a very protective response by the body. And then we also have chronic pain, and chronic pain results from diseases and disorders like diabetes, and it can be made worse by the environment, both internally and externally, both by your nutrition as well as your daily life. And chronic pain is very resistant to medication and surgery. And the way that we usually define chronic pain is that it's a pain that lasts for more than 6 weeks, or it's reoccurring at least 4 times a year. And the bad news about chronic pain is that it tends to increase in pain levels over time. But there's a middle zone that we talk about in MELT. We call sudden chronic pain. And the problem with sudden chronic pain is it's a very gray area of pain treatment. It is usually treated like it's an acute pain. And the problem with that is that it just isn't an acute trauma. It is not an actual result of a sudden specific source. It's actually caused by accumulated stress. So it's usually caused by our repetitive postural habits and repetitive movements and the way that the nervous system behaves and responds to our daily life. So environmental stressors, both again internal and external, foods that you eat, the relationships that you have, how much you love your job, your happiness in life, if you have joy or if you're constantly angry, can be considered stressors to our body that can also cause pain signals. And the problem with sudden chronic pain is that we get these pre-pain signals quite often that go unnoticed or ignored, like when you sit for long periods of time and you get up and your joints feel stiff and achy, but you move around and it goes away. So more often than not, if you're in that category, you're missing that as being a signal that your brain is giving you that, hey, something's kind of a little off here, maybe we could take care of this. And if you're like most people and you ignore it, it can certainly accumulate. The other issue with sudden chronic pain is that doctors tend to treat it, again, like it's an acute trauma. And the bad news also with sudden chronic pain and acute pain is that they can both turn into chronic pain. Again, a side effect of trauma quite often is a scar tissue issue that causes a pain response in the body that signals the brain that something is wrong. So although 100% of the time the brain is what produces our sense of pain, the process and physiology of pain is really complex. And the bad news about pain, again, is that there's no specific pain centers in the brain, which is bad news because that means that there's no one method that will eliminate the brain pain's response. And these ignition nodes, these areas or regions that get lit up, are the same areas that we use for feeling and sensation and movements. It's how we react and respond to our external environment. And it's also the areas where we produce emotions and memory. So quite often, our own emotional state can trigger a response from something that happened in your history. It's basically like pain gets cataloged in your brain's library, and emotions can become very associated with that particular issue you had. So if it was something like you hate your job, and while you're sitting at your job, your boss is always yelling at you and your neck hurts you. Now, even when your boss isn't yelling at you, your neck hurts you when you sit down. And actually, it can get to the point where you just think about going to work in the morning and your neck hurts you. And it actually is that part of your brain that's lighting up. And it's basically like pain hijacks those areas of your brain to express itself because we use those areas so often. And so it's your body's way of giving you the attention. However, what basically happens in a very technical process is something called potentiation, and that's where the brain keeps sending the same signals through the same neurological pathways. And it's kind of like taking a sled and going down a mountain in snow, where the first time you go down, it's a little slow and you've got to carve out the groove. But once the groove is carved out, you get down the mountain faster and faster and faster. And the same thing can occur with pain response, is that you don't even have to do the movement that used to cause you pain. Thinking about the movement can actually elicit the pain response. So very often what then occurs is something called neuroplasticity. So sometimes the protective pain that could start as an acute issue can persist even after the healing occurs, or it might even appear when there is no apparent cause at all. You could say, I didn't do anything. I woke up with it. So that type of pain is very linked to the changes in the nervous system, that neuroplasticity. So that's what is responding to the internal and external changes, and that can reorganize itself and adapt through your lifetime. And that phenomenon is known as neuronal plasticity, and that's also the process that allows us to learn, remember, and recover from brain injuries. So neuroplasticity is a good thing. Again, just like when you do the potentiation, if you do it as a positive way, like you're a baseball player, you want to hit a ball, the more times you practice, the easier it is for you to get up to bat and hit that ball. The less psychology goes into it, and you just go out and it's like automatic and you do it. But following an injury or a disease process, sometimes the nervous system undergoes a structural and functional reorganization that is not a healthy form of plasticity, and that can cause very long-term maladaptive changes in both the peripheral and the central nervous system. So the body, the periphery, the sensory nervous system can adapt, as well as the sensory nervous system. And that can make us very hypersensitive to pain. And again, it can make pain persist far after any injuries are healed. And what can oftentimes happen with neuroplasticity and potentiation is what I call thought viruses, that you start to associate beliefs that can be powerful enough to maintain a pain state. So, you start having these mantras in your mind. I'm in pain, so there must be really something harmful happening to my body, or I'm not doing anything until this pain goes away. And so you end up just sitting at your desk all the time. You just don't, you just sit all the time. You don't do anything anymore. And so, or you just say, well, the doctors couldn't find anything wrong, so I must be really bad. And you kind of lose your life, you lose your happiness, you lose your joy when those sort of things occur. But although we know 100% of the time the brain is what produces our sense of pain, and that neuroplasticity and potentiation exist, there are advances in fascial research and biology, and because of these micron microscopes that have been used in the human body, we now have a dedicated study of connective tissue. And since 2007, the research has really exploded, and there is so much more that we know about connective tissue. So I shared with you guys the concept of the functional and structural elements of fascia. So just on a functional level, connective tissue is the extracellular matrix. It is the three-dimensional fluid-based system that supports, protects, and stabilizes everything. There's no separation in it from skin to bone. It protects your muscles, it connects muscles, it stabilizes bones and joints, it keeps your organs stable, and keeps your body moving efficiently. It basically establishes your structural framework. It transports fluids. It dissolves material and waste through our body. That's where waste derives itself through, is the extracellular matrix. Cells, when they try to offset toxins, if you will, it goes through the extracellular matrix, and then ideally you either sweat it out, pee it out, spit it out, whatever. And connective tissue, again, supports, surrounds, and protects everything. It stores energy reserves, both in the way of fat as well as its elastic properties that it possesses. It's what allows elastic recoil in our movement for propulsion to exist. And on a cellular level, connective tissue also defends the body from microorganisms, and it enables cell growth and differentiation to occur, as well as cell proliferation is actually existing in the connective tissue. So connective tissue is basically what supports our cells. On a structural level, on a macro level, it's supporting our muscles and bones, but on a micro level, the structural elements of connective tissue in the extracellular matrix are the cells themselves. The primary cell of connective tissue are fibroblasts, even though there's a lot of other cells in connective tissue. The cells of our connective tissue, fibroblasts, are what produce all of the stuff inside of our body that support, protect, and stabilize things. So it's producing the collagen and the elastin and reticular fibers and fibrils that are able to move and adapt, and they bind with water that we get from our nutrients and creates that stable architecture. Fibroblasts also produce the ground substances or interstitial tissue, the hyaluronic acid, the proteoglycans, the glycoaminoglycans. Those are the protein-based cells with rings of carbohydrate around it that attract the water into the matrix and creates that soluble glue-like structure of fascia and allows the collagen to then bind with that water molecule and create, again, its strong integrity. So there's this stiffness and elasticity, and that fine balance of stiffness to elasticity is very reliant upon our the fluid in the tissue. So on top of that, we also talked about the three components of connective tissue that are important to kind of have a little bit of language on is hydration, extensibility, and communication. And so the first is hydration. Again, this is the fluid flow, and so we talk about what causes dehydration in connective tissue is living. In fact, you could eat right, exercise, you could be young, old, fit, not fit. It doesn't matter. Daily living is causing cellular dehydration in every human body every single day, regardless of activity, age, or fitness level. It doesn't matter. It's in fact a natural cellular process that's existing for every single person every single day. And so you can't exercise or strengthen your way out of it. It's happening. But as much as it's happening, you can do things to reverse its accumulative effects. Because if you think of connective tissue like a river, daily living is causing this sediment to accumulate in the river. So if you never do anything about it, what starts out as these small local regions or pockets of cellular dehydration, like maybe in your shoulder or your neck from sitting at your desk and using a mouse all day long, it can quite quickly cause adaptability in the muscle system, and then the myofascial systems, where myofascia crosses over to the opposite side, can then cause opposite hip and knee problems. And so if you're focusing on the areas where you have pain, you're sort of missing the fact that connective tissue, being a global system, is actually having trouble in body-wide. And that's actually the thing that people miss, especially when they're doing repair work. If they go to see a PT, is that they kind of hone in on just one area instead of looking at the global matrix and try to restore that first. Now, I'm not saying that working on a knee injury if you've had ACL damage is not the right thing to do. It's just that if you hydrated the whole connective tissue matrix and then you did that localized work, you're always going to achieve better results, faster results, and sustain those changes longer. So in MELT, instead of talking about connective tissue dehydration too much, we call it stuck stress. So we always try to simplify things down, and I always say people are just full of stuck stress. And what this stuck stress does as it's accumulating is it alters the extensibility of the fascia, which is the tensegrity architecture. So on a macro level, connective tissue is what manages tensional compression, pull, and it has a threshold of resistance or stretch so that it can manage our movements to support muscles so that muscles don't stretch too far and you strain them, or compress too quickly and then you get a spasm. But again, it only is functioning that way if fascia is hydrated. And around our joints, it's all connective tissue. So connective tissue is also causing shock absorption to exist around our joints so that our joints don't compress and hit, and you don't damage those facets in your spine, causing nerve root compression and damage to the spine. But again, if connective tissue is cellularly dehydrated, it decreases fascial extensibility. Fascia doesn't react and respond fast enough. That's going to decrease muscular flexibility and responsiveness. And over time, you're actually altering your own stability architecture for your entire body. And that's the biggest issue. On a micro level, with extensibility, you have these things called microvacuoles, multi-microvascular spaces, and these gliding surfaces that microvacuoles allow fascia to basically slip and slide from layer to layer. And each layer, from superficial to deep fascial systems, play different roles and react in unique ways. Like the superficial fascia is very good as an insulator, whereas the deep fascia is what connects muscle to muscle so that you have synergy in your motion. But as a global system, the whole fascial network has viscoelastic or mechanical properties that relate to the fluid gel components and to those elastic properties of fascia that allow it to move and adapt and then ideally return to its ideal shape. However, what we know about connective tissue is if you pull or compress connective tissue in local regions, like you sit for long periods of time, that can cause damage to the multi-microvascular spaces and those gliding surfaces. That can cause elastic deformation. So again, that creates a strain or a collapse or a loss of energy in the body. And so our movements become a little less seamless and smooth. Our joints ache more often. And if we don't restore the fluid state of those multi-microvascular spaces and bubble them back up, if you think of them as bubbles, as blowing those bubbles or inflating them back up with new fluid, if they collapse, you get something called tissue remodeling. And that's where, traditionally, tissue remodeling is about an injury. If you cut yourself, fibroblasts turn into myofibroblasts, and the myofibroblasts help to reconstruct injured tissue by secreting new extracellular fluids and that soluble infrastructure, and it exerts these myofibroblasts can exert contractile forces to the surrounding cells and pull the regions of your skin back together. If you cut yourself, that the myofibroblast is what contracts and pulls those skin elements back together. And although the scar may look to fix the problem, the underlying plane, the superficial fascia, can be forever altered if you're not then, after the wound has healed, restoring the actual structure of the matrix. Now, in deep wounds, like if you had a surgery, some of that tissue remodeling and scarring cannot be fully repaired. That's why scars, although they look close to the old tissue, they always have a little bit of remnant because you never quite repair perfectly back to its original shape. And the thing about tissue remodeling is what we're recognizing is that dehydration, just from the daily living and from that constant stretch or pull, can also alter the actual structure of the fascia, and that can cause deregulation of the activities of fascia, its ability to move and adapt, and that can lead to tissue contracture and fibrosis in the absence of injury. So that's the biggest conundrum of fascia, is that it can we can actually alter our own fascial continuum just from daily living. So again, myofibroblasts, we know that they react to tension and compression and stress when it's applied. So beyond just tissue remodeling, if connective tissue is on a constant state of tension or compression, fibroblasts can turn into myofibroblasts and start to pull and cause stress and strain in the fascial continuum to try to hold it together so that it doesn't pull or resist the uptake of compression when stress is applied. But over time, that can cause fibrotic tissue. And at particular levels of stress that we have, they're really required to induce myofibroblast development. But in the research, we're starting to recognize that very little stress can actually cause that development. It doesn't have to be that you cut yourself or that there's wound healing that's even needed. So in the absence of wound healing, that's where tissue remodeling is really a problem. It's a good thing and a bad thing. We also talked about the viscoelastic properties of fascia, and this is the property of any material that exhibits both viscous, thick, and elastic characteristics, stiff and elastic properties, when undergoing deformation is called a viscoelastic structure. So fascia exhibits a nonlinear response to the strain rate, and that's considered a non-Newtonian fluid. So what we know about connective tissue is that as you contract your bicep, it's not just the agonist and antagonist concept of muscles, one muscle shortening means one muscle lengthening, that fascia disperses information laterally. It disperses it across planes so that it actually, before the muscle even lengthens on the other side, the fascia is actually what is preparing that muscle to lengthen on one side, contract on another. And so again, hydration is ultimately important, because the properties of fascia, the 5 primary properties, are stiffness, elasticity, tone, stress relaxation time, and creep. And the most important pieces are stiffness to elasticity. So stiffness is the fascia's ability to resist deformation when force or stress is applied. That's its viscous property. And then the elastic property is fascia's and collagen's ability to adapt to stress, move, stretch, compress, pull, but then return to its ideal size and shape when it's at rest. When you have the fine balance of both, you have quality of tone of fascia. That's fascia's responsiveness and the balance between stiffness and elasticity. And then you also have something called stress relaxation time, and that's the observed decrease in the stress response when constant strain is generated. So we would like to improve the stress relaxation time, and for many of us, we put stress on it, and instead of the tissue zoop going right back to its original shape when we stop doing that position, it's kind of like, it moves more slowly, and that causes a lot of problems as well. And then we also have creep, and that's the deformation permanently under the influence of constant mechanical stress when an increased amount of strain or thickness occurs. So what we know about low back pain, and in our low back pain research study, is that if your low back is constantly under an amount of strain, and that's what happens when you sit for long periods of time, that fascia becomes thick. And when you get creep, that's a bigger problem, because that can cause pain in the absence of injury entirely. We also talked about the communication component of fascia, and that was the body-wide signaling system, and we talked about proprioceptors and mechanoreceptors. And what we know is that there are 10 times more sensory nerve endings in connective tissue than in muscle, and that's really a profound research finding over the past decade. And it really changes what we know about how we sense the world. We're not doing it so much through our muscles as through our fascia. In fact, fascia, connective tissue, is the largest sensory organ in the entire body, and we actually take more information in through our connective tissue than we do through our common senses of sight, vision, hearing, and taste. And then we also talked about how all of this issue in our connective tissue, what is the secondary part of the neurofascial system, is the autonomic nervous system, is how the autonomic nervous system relies on fascia to function efficiently. And the autonomic nervous system, we talked about 3 components: the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric nervous system. And what we simplified in language for you guys was the stress, restore, and gut regulators. And what basically occurs in our body, both in a physical as well as in a mental state, is stress, is that our ability to endure stress has become challenging for most of us in this electronic era, where most of us are very repetitive. We're looking at screens for long periods of time. We're not out there looking out at distance. And so it's actually altering our ability to manage stress. So all incoming stress is present. Remember, it's not just a bear walking into a room, but when you are awake, the stress regulator is dominant, and any incoming information that you endure is perceived as stress. But ideally, for every time you have a stress response, whether it's somebody saying, hey, you got a deadline and we got to hurry it up, or you've got to move quickly away from a car that's moving quickly, or somebody puts you on the spot and says, explain what connective tissue does, and your heart rate goes up and your pupils dilate and things like that. For every stress response, ideally the restored regulators return our body back to balance after there's an increase of stress response. But the problem is when our daily lives outweigh our ability to rest and repair efficiently, the scale tips and we can no longer maintain efficiency. So actually our body's working harder and harder and harder just to maintain regular balance. And so we're relying on our sleep process to allow the restored regulator to be dominant and to kind of slough off all of the accumulated stress that we've managed all of our day. And ideally at night, our stress levels go back to balance. But the thing is, a lot of us are not getting a restful night's sleep. And what we know about balance is that if the restored regulator is always under duress and it never has its time to be dominant because we're not sleeping throughout the night, we are reducing our intuition, our healing ability, our cell renewal, cell proliferation, cellular transportation. We are accumulating stress in the way of waste. We are not absorbing nutrient as efficiently. Our colon is getting full of poop all day long, and then we're not pooping it out quick enough because our gut is slowing down. All sorts of problems start to occur. And we actually lose REM hours, REM sleep. And so our natural daily functions can actually really be affected. So, you know, again, at night, ideally you go back to this efficiency zone, but if you don't get a restful night's sleep, you're constantly in the stress state even when you're sleeping. And if the stress response is always dominant, that can actually activate an autonomic response where the peripheral nervous system starts to really get stressed. And that can affect both how you're perceiving the outside world. Again, you can become very pain sensitive, very stress sensitive, start getting symptoms that seem completely unrelated to fascia, like poor digestion. Your motor movements become a little bit slow. Your endocrine system gets out of balance. So now suddenly your body's pumping out a whole bunch of pro-inflammatory hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, even when you're not active. And if you get high levels of pro-inflammatory hormones constantly being pumped into the body, that can cause you to literally become sick, and your own immune system can go haywire and work against you. And now you have things like chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia. What also occurs when you have this autonomic response is this low-grade inflammation. If the endocrine system is constantly pumping up pro-inflammatory hormones, that can induce an inflammation response. And when inflammation occurs, pain responses are even higher. And what they've linked are this cytokine response that can occur. And cytokines are basically a link between the nervous and immune systems. And the cytokines are this group of proteins that are supposed to shield disease, and it also responds to tissue injury by promoting inflammation. So when you cut yourself, cytokines react, or if you have a really tough workout, cytokines are released to repair muscle damage. And that's a good thing when that happens. But what we're finding is that cytokines are found in the nervous system, but they're also a part of the immune system. And what can occur if you have this autonomic response that's constantly in action from stress, that can cause inflammation in the absence of injury or damage. And so if the cytokine levels rise in the brain or the area of damage, or just regions of the body are responding, pain symptoms are going to be present. And sometimes it's for no reason except stress. And if that occurs, if the endocrine system and cortisol and adrenaline are constantly being pumped into your body, and your immune system goes a little haywire, your gut regulator, the enteric nervous system, gets completely trashed. And we talked about how the gut regulator is managing every intricate aspect of the gut and digestion. So if imbalances arise, digestive issues and food intolerances can increase, proper absorption and transportation of nutrients and cell proliferation decrease, and that can cause waste accumulation, and that can arise, it can cause inflammation and toxicity. And so now your gut is completely haywire, and now you're getting even more symptoms that seem even more unrelated to fascia, trouble digesting food, again, not just motor response, but you're gaining weight for no reason. And then you start getting all of these other symptoms. You've got this inflammatory response, now you got anxiety and depression, you have sleep issues, digestive issues, constipation, weight gain, lack of energy, stress injuries, joint pain, you are in the pain problem. And if you don't have pain today, you're setting yourself up for more systemic and neurological issues later. So the ultimate outcome of MELT, what is our goal? Is to restore health, efficiency, and stability. And I said the three most important aspects of the human body are the health of the nervous system, the body's communication network, the body's efficiency in regulating chemical and hormonal balance, which includes metabolism, and the quality and integrity of the connective tissue or the stability architecture. So our goal in MELT is to improve neurological response, to reduce the stress in the human body, to regain natural chemical and hormonal balance. And the way that we're going about it is by directly affecting the connective tissue system and also the autonomic nervous system through things like the rebalance sequence. We did the MELT research study, and this kind of goes along with what I was talking about the tensegrity model and that thickening or the tissue remodeling that can occur in that low back pain. So we took people through 4 weeks of melting, and in the first week we had started them with just the foot treatment in our research study, and we just started them with the softball foot treatment. And then we used the body roller, and after doing the softball foot treatment, we also had them do the rebalance sequence for 1 week, and we recommended that they do it at least 3 times a week, but they could have done it up to every day if they wanted to. And it didn't matter to us. We said at least a minimum of 3 times a week. So the rebalance and the foot treatment was in that first week. And then in week 2, we did the upper body compression sequence. Interestingly, a lot of people have low back pain because of the posture of sitting. They're actually dehydrating the upper body. So we had them work on the upper body, and we had them do the lower body compression sequence also. So they worked on the back of the legs, the calves, and the inner thigh to try to also restore some of the fluid flow back to the lumbar fascia, to try to draw and attract fluids to that primary space in the abdomen. And that's really one of the compelling things about MELT is even in that second week, we were already finding tremendous changes in people's bodies, in their pain response. When we would ask them how they were doing, their pain was already reduced. And then in week 3, we had them add in the lower body length techniques, the bent knee press, the hip to heel press, and the tuck and tilt challenge, so that they began to drive some more activation toward the low back. And that was pretty profound for a lot of people, probably one of the more difficult aspects of them. And then we added the low back release sequence in that final week, so that by the last week they were doing all of the treatments. And what was really tremendous was the results that we had, that people had significantly decreased their low back pain, both in the immediate, in that first session as well as long term. They increased flexibility, and they also reduced the thickness of that lumbar fascia. And what was, I think, the most curious change was that on the side of their lumbar spine that was thicker, it just naturally specialized and reduced the thickness on the side that was thicker on its own, not because we were working more on the right leg or the left leg. The body just organized the fascial continuum better, and so it matched the thickness from left to right in just 4 weeks and reduced their low back pain. So we also, in the trainings, we've talked about the living body model, and this is really the component of MELT to simplify the neurofascial system. We talked about the autopilot was our regulation element, and this was about the receptive regulating system of support, protection, and stability, and allowed body communication to occur. It manages and regulates other systems of the body, mostly without our conscious control. So as a simplified way, I always say the autopilot are the parts of your body that support, protect, and stabilize you without your conscious awareness or involuntary control. And then we also talked about body sense, and that was our communication element of the living body model. And we were talking about this earlier on, that more information is actually received through body sense, through the connective tissue, than through our common senses. And body sense gives us the ability to respond to incoming information through these proprioceptors and these mechanoreceptors that live in fascia. And the proprioceptors, the sensory nerve endings, are what relay information to the autopilot's GPS system and allow our brain to figure out where our joints are in relationship to gravity and our center of gravity in the ground, so that we can appropriate motion. And hydration is the essential component of body sense. So technically our autopilot is what uses body sense, but we can learn to use body sense and sense where stuck stress is living in our body rather than focusing on where we have pain. And that was a really big component of using MELT, is to identify and understand how to use body sense. And we also talked about the tensional energy model, which is our fluid vibration element. And this is about the natural fluid flow of fascia. That connective tissue, because it has a piezoelectric force to it, is in a continuous energetic directional current, both within us and around us. It's taking vibration through us. But that fourth phase, that crystallized element of water, is what allows it to move and adapt in this nice fluid state. And the tensional energy is comprised of both physiological and emotional energy. It can be emotionally charged as well. And the fluid flow and vibration of connective tissue responds to that energetic current of our energy field. So when people talk about chi and things like that, the fluid is actually responding to our own energetic levels. So when if you are constantly angry or depressed, kind of think about how that energy force is in your body and how that could then, on an electrical level, kind of alter the natural state of stability and movement in your own fluid flow. So when the current is diverted or interrupted, that body-wide communication slows down. And I always just define tensional energy as thinking about like fluid in a tub, that if you started moving fluid in the same direction, all of the molecules of water start to move in that same direction. And that is very similar to what we're doing with MELT, is to create tensional integrity through the fascial system with a technique called rinsing. We also had a fourth element called the masses and spaces. This was our architectural element. And what we always talk about is just the balance between the masses and spaces is what creates ideal alignment and stability. And when necessary, the body creates oppositional compensation to maintain relative balance. So if the hips go forward, the ribs go back, the head carriage goes forward, as far as your brain's concerned, you're still upright, only that can very much compromise your neck and your low back. So again, instead of focusing on where you have pain, when you do the rest assess, you're actually using the model of the masses and spaces and your body sense to identify where stuck stress is living in your body and how it's affecting your body's ability to maintain relative balance. And the autopilot regulates balance and stabilization of our masses and spaces in order to protect organs and nerves while we remain upright. So by using body sense and noticing our masses and spaces and how our body is maintaining balance, we are actually supporting our own autopilot's ability to identify where stuck stress is living and then treating it so that the autopilot can function more efficiently. And then the fifth element was the neural core stabilization element. This is the big nut of our core. The neural core is a simplified model that defines the very complex neurofascial systems that connect, support, and stabilize our entire body from head to toe. And when I talk about the neural core, I'm talking about the reflexive and rooting mechanisms of our body, the righting reflexes, the equilibrium reflexes, that we sort of take for granted and most of us don't know much about. But the nervous system is constantly trying to identify where our pelvis is in relationship to the floor, and it is the stabilization element of the neural core that allows the masses and spaces and the architectural element to maintain relative balance. The neural core is really what the autopilot relies upon to keep the pelvis stable so that we can move. So to apply the living body model to the general public, we created the 4 R's of MELT: reconnect, rebalance, rehydrate, and release. The reconnect moves allow you to identify the immediate changes you've made from the rebalance, rehydrate, and release techniques and encourage you to keep melting. And reconnecting before and after each sequence is actually a part of the technique. It's what allows the autopilot to reset to a better place. And it also educates people on how to identify where stuck stress is living in their body so they don't have to focus on where they have pain and they don't chase their pain, but instead start to identify identify the cause of the pain rather than the symptom of pain and where they're feeling it. We had the rebalance component of the 4Rs, and the rebalance moves in general. If you did the 3D breath breakdown or the 3D breath or any of those types of moves, those help the neurological regulators of stress and repair sustain connection and balance. And the rebalancing techniques also help the autopilot regulate neurological balance through diaphragmatic motion and neurological core reflexes to reestablish balance in those reflexes. And then also we reacquire neural core control and timing to the rooted and reflexive mechanisms for improved stability and balance. And in the MELT Method book, we have the basic rebalance sequence, and in level 2, we'll be adding more techniques and more moves to further enhance the rebalancing effect and to directly affect the neurocore. So instead of thinking so much about rehydrating connective tissue, the rebalancing techniques directly address neurological inefficiencies in the neurocore stabilization elements of our body. Then we had the rehydrate techniques, the compression and lengthening techniques, the glide, shear, and rinse. Gliding, you'll remember, is a way to prepare connective tissue for the shearing techniques, and also a way for us to identify areas where the bubbles, if you will, those multimicrovascular spaces, have lost their integrity to move, morph, and adapt. And what we call a barrier, it's a way to identify those areas of adhesions or the reduction of the gliding surfaces of fascia. And then the shearing stimulates the connective tissue cells through local compression force and allows some stimulation in these local regions to restore those multimicrovascular spaces as we rinse. That's what creates the global fluid exchange, brings fluid back into those multimicrovascular spaces, and restores tensional energy and fluid flow of the connective tissue. And then we also had lengthening techniques. You can pull on fascia in local but more long planes of myofascial lines to create two-directional pull to restore tensional energy. So instead of working in compression, the fibroblasts are very reactive to tensional pull. And what we know is if we create local regions of tension in a very specific way, we can actually cause a challenge for the elastic properties. And then when we let it go, it helps to create that recoil effect in fascia and allows those cells to restore their integrity. And so lengthening techniques can create a very global fluid flow exchange. If fascia is hydrated in a way, even if you just did gliding, shearing, and rinsing on your feet, and then you did some lengthening techniques, like bent knee press or hip to heel press, you could actually continue that fluid flow up through the pelvis even more directly. After you do any type of compression techniques. Lengthening techniques are great to go after a compression technique. And you can use lengthening techniques instead of a rinse for people who have trouble rinsing their bodies. And then we have the release techniques. In level 1, we learned the neck and low back release techniques. And this is a way to decompress the primary and secondary spaces of our body in our hands, feet, neck, and low back. And that improves the mobility of the neck and low back space and restores joint space in the hands and feet. And in level 2, we'll also now be learning the sternal release. So in the hand and foot training, you learned the global effect of you can actually acquire all 4Rs with the global treatments of the hand and foot techniques. And these treatments provide whole body rejuvenation and create the most comprehensive results of any of the MELT techniques. So in any class you do, doing a mini hand or a mini foot treatment is always a great starting place, especially if you have newcomers to the group, because it gives you that opportunity also to describe the language of melting. And in the hand and foot techniques, you learned some of the assessments, the wrist assess, the grip assess, the standing assessments, toe lift assess, spine flex assess, hip hinge assess. We had lots of them. And then we learned the position point pressing, glide, shear, rinse, and also friction. And we know position point pressing and friction we only do on the hands and the feet. And position point pressing can be considered a rebalancing technique because you're stimulating those sensory nerve endings in those nerve clusters around our joints where mechanoreceptors are in high abundance. We have many, many more mechanoreceptors around joints than anywhere else in the body. So in level 1, we learned a number of sequences. We learned the rebalance sequence where we did our rest assess with gentle rocking, the tuck and the tilt, Both of those are reconnect techniques to help your nervous system reacquire connection to your center of gravity by either challenging your balance or isolating movement or differentiating motion to the pelvis. And then we had 2 rebalancing techniques called the 3D breath breakdown and the 3D breath. The 3D breath breakdown stimulated diaphragmatic motion. 3D breath helped to re-engage the core reflex. And then, of course, the rest reassessed to see if we noticed some changes. And we remember the direct and indirect changes that ideally this treatment can make. The direct change is in the diaphragmatic region in the arch of the back, but you might notice that your upper and lower body changes exist, and you might even free up your neck from restoring core stability. Also, with the rebalance sequence, you also can help improve autopilot efficiency from left to right. That's really the primary goal of that technique. And then we had the upper body compression sequence, one of my very favorites. I do this one almost every day with rib length assess and the upper body and inner shoulder blade gliding and shearing, and then the upper body rinsing with the rib length reassess. And again, ideally, you get great upper body changes here. The arms are more relaxed, the ribs are more weighted, the head turns better. You might also notice that the low back curve is much less, or you make the lower body changes in the pelvis and the legs. Then we also had the upper body length sequence. This was the rest assess with gentle rocking to help the autopilot reacquire its connection to your center of gravity with that reconnect technique. But then you had hydration techniques, lengthening techniques, the shoulder blade reach and the double arm reach, and then the rest reassess. And then we also had the lower body compression sequence, working on the inner thigh, back thigh, calf, and the rinsing to restore some of the integrity of the lower body, to get the butt cheeks more weighted than tailbone, back of the thighs to the ground. But I always find that with the lower body compression sequence, people make tremendous changes up above. And again, that's a great way to relay the indirect before direct approach that MELT has, and can guide people away from chasing their pain and going right to the areas that bother them. In the lower body length sequence, we also had the rest assess, the SI joint shear, the modified tuck and tilt challenge with the feet on the ground, and you can also do the tuck and tilt challenge there, and then the bent knee press and the hip to heel press. I usually do the modified tuck and tilt challenge if I'm just doing the lower body length sequence, because that educates people on the tuck and the tilt, so that you do the tuck with the bent knee press and the tilt with the hip to heel press. And then we also had the low back release sequence, which was SI joint shear to draw some fluids back up to the low back, and then the pelvic tuck and tilt challenge and the low back decompress, sustaining that position of the tilt with the ribs heavy and the thighs pressing into the hands. Great one for people who, in my mind, have any kind of upper back or hip issues, is to release their low back, especially my clients with sciatica. And then the neck release sequence, the base of skull shear, doing the side lying base of skull, and the neck decompress technique, that subtle head nodding. Oftentimes I find people do the neck release sequence and the rest of their body completely resets to a better place. So these 6 primary sequences of the MELT Method book, we learned how to blend and add moves or take moves away to create other sequences, and also to create full MELT maps. And that would be enough for most people. But we also, in the level 1 training, had some additional level 1 moves. We learned the single leg lift, which was another rebalancing technique to challenge the rooting mechanism instead of the reflexive mechanisms. And we also learned other rehydrate techniques. We learned the single arm reach, the neck turn, and one of my very favorites, the drawbridge. And these are also great lengthening techniques to restore fluid flow back to the low back and the shoulder girdle. And we also learned the outer thigh glide and shear, which is a phenomenal one for people who have low back pain. And we learned about the facelift, both using the roller and the balls. Now we approach level 2, and I'm excited that you guys are here for the level 2 sequences and to really refine your language here after your pre-training. You had additional level 2 moves. We're going to have the rib curl, which is a differentiation of the ribs instead of the pelvis, and the secret of that one is sustaining pelvic neutral positions. People like to tuck their pelvis on that one. That one's technical, but it's pretty profound to restore rib motion, because oftentimes people who have low back and neck pain, their ribs they can't flex or extend them. So this is, again, a move to assess also your range. It's a great movement of reconnect, being able to rib curl, because it's working on differentiation. And then along with that, we now, with a rebalance technique, we're going to be really honing in on the core challenge. And the core challenge is so profound because it's truly a pumping action to your hip flexors, to psoas. And it allows psoas to release on one side while contracting on the other repeatedly. And that can help tremendously to restore the fine balance of the reflexive and rooting mechanisms. And then we'll also learn the sternal decompress. And those reconnect, rebalance, and release moves, there's just 3 of them. But you're also going to learn 14 new rehydrate moves, and you've been working with these in your pre-training program. We have rib side bend, the arm circles, the neck side bend, very technical one, not for everyone, the tail triangle gliding, the SI joint glide, deep and side hip glide and shear. The shins, working on the shins, you can do that with the balls or with the roller, and I'll show you some other variations of the shin when we're in the training. And then we also have the front thigh, outer thigh in the upper regions. People have trouble with that upper thigh gliding and shearing. They like to stay on the hip, but you got to get below the trochanter on that. And we also have the hip to heel rotate and cross, and the figure 4 and the hip side bend for the lower body length techniques. All frequent lengthening techniques for me. I hope that you guys enjoyed practicing those. And then we also have the lower body compression sequences. We're going to be talking about the tail triangle glide, the SI joint glide, deep hip glide and shear, side hip glide and shear, and the rest reassess. And we also have another lower body compression sequence that we'll talk about, working on the shins, the front thigh, the upper outer thigh, the front and outer thigh rinsing. That one also a great complement to many things, and we'll look at some variations of that one. And then one of the most technical and to me very profound sequences I call the sternal release sequence. And this one combines the upper body compression sequence with the sternal decompression, and you're blending that into this sequence. And I just find it's extremely profound because you're also going to release the heart center. So during the training, I hope you guys will have a lot of fun. I hope that you have prepared yourself in full with the pre-training program and that you've practiced those moves so that we can get right to the techniques. You guys will be in a lot of breakout sessions with the master trainers and working through your language and refining your own movements to ensure in both a one-on-one environment and in a group environment that you're able to both convey verbally and also troubleshoot with people quickly all of the level 2 moves and quickly add them to your repertoire. So I look forward to seeing you guys in the level 2 teacher training, and I hope that this presentation was helpful. Happy melting.